Hey guys, I'm back with a new video. In the previous video, learn about the constructor functions. We also learn about prototypes and prototypal inheritance. So in this video, we'll learn about classes in JavaScript. Classes. Okay. So we'll learn about classes in JavaScript, how under the hood it makes use of prototypal chains and inheritance. If you haven't gone through my JavaScript objects playlist and the previous videos of this series, definitely go check them out right now. In the coming videos, you need to have a good understanding of JavaScript objects and all of the properties of objects that we have covered thus far. Also, you must be extremely comfortable in applying the rules of the this keyword to figure out the value of this in different scenarios. Now, without wasting any more time, let us learn about the new topic which is closely connected to JavaScript objects, and this is object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming. Now, let us first understand what we mean by object-oriented programming. So it's an approach of writing your code using objects. So using some real-world entity, and each entity that you can think of can be treated as an object. It has a certain property, or you can say certain properties and methods associated to it. It is just a way of structuring your code and altogether a new way of reasoning and thinking about your code. Now, the idea behind object-oriented programming is that you work with real-world entities in your code. Let us see how we can implement this into our code using something called as classes. So like if we take into consideration a person object will have certain properties like age, like hair color, and say the planet, and he can have certain methods like eat method or walk method or any other method like exercise method. So we can basically model a person object using some blueprint. So class is such a blueprint. Okay, a class is a blueprint that defines the properties and methods that should be followed by every instance that is built on top of it. So basically we will have a certain blueprint that defines all the properties and methods, and then we can create an instance based or build up from this class, and the object that is built on top of this class will have certain properties and methods attached to it. Now, classes are just syntactical sugar over the constructor functions that we had learned in one of the previous videos. Now, classes were introduced in the first place in ES6 so that new developers can feel home-like with what other languages like Java, C++ used to define these blueprints. So the class keyword in JavaScript is inspired from other object-oriented programming languages like Java and C++. Now let's understand the difference between objects and classes. Let us understand that first, objects represent entities like a user object. So this is a user object, and this blueprint is basically your class. So your person class from which you are creating a user object, or you can say a person object to be precise. Not user object, a person object. Okay, and object represent entities. Okay, a real one entity where a user or where a person can have certain properties like name and age, hair color, planet, and many other properties, address. You can define in many such properties on the user or the person object, and some methods which can be invoked on the person object. On the other hand, classes are blueprints for objects. So we have a blueprint that an object should adhere to when it is constructed, and based on that blueprint that we define using the class keyword, it will get all the properties and methods defined in the class on which it is built up from. So you can say objects are instances of classes. That means they are based on your classes, whereas classes define how an object should look like. Also, classes will make creation of multiple similar objects much easier. So based on this blueprint, you can create any number of persons with their own set of properties and methods associated to the object. Okay, and it is built up from that very same blueprint that we are working on, which is the person class. So any number of person objects you can build from this blueprint. Okay, because all the objects that we create will follow a blueprint that we define under the class. Now the class provides easy and reusable way of creating the objects which are guaranteed to look same. Now let us define a simple class. So what I will do is I will go back to my Visual Studio Code editor, and in the file what I will do is I will create a class and I will use the class keyword. So I will say class person, and then let us define our constructor function. So the constructor function will take certain properties like name, age, gender is gamer, and then all the properties that you set are done inside the constructor function or your constructor method. Now once the constructor is done setting up the values of the properties that you provide, it will spit out the new instance or the new object that we can make use of. So I will say this dot name, this is used to refer to the current instance that is getting created once the constructor gets invoked. So this dot name is set to name, this dot age is set to age, this dot gender is set to gender, and this dot is gamer is set to is gamer. Okay, where the name, age, and gender are basically string properties, and is gamer is a boolean property. Now here a log person information is the method that we can define on the class. So what I will do is I will define a method, and all the methods that you define on the class will go on the prototype of the class, okay, and not on the class itself. So the log person information, and I will say console.log this dot name is a this dot gender and is this dot age years old, and I will say gamer status this dot is gamer. Now then we can define something called as static methods that are functions on the class itself, okay, and not on the prototype. The normal methods that we defined, like this log person information method, the above method which I'm showing you, which is a log person information method, it is defined on the prototype of the class, whereas when we work with static methods, they are the methods or the functions on the class itself, okay, and not on the prototype, because we know that classes under the hood are syntactical sugar over the prototypal concept. Now these static methods that I am going to declare use the static keyword. So what I will do is I will write a comment here and say static methods. So static means that we are defining a method on the class and not on the prototype. So we're defining on person not prototype, on the person class in this case, and not on person not prototype. And the log person information method is basically sitting on person not prototype because it's a normal instance method. But when you're working with static method, those are defined on the person class and not on person not prototype. So static describe, and I will say return I am the person class. Now then we can also define other methods on the class. So the static methods, as you can see, are declared using the static keyword and they are called directly on the class. So even without creating an instance of the class, these methods can be called as they are callable using the name of the class. Then we can also define getters and setters on our class. So getters are basically used to get the value pertaining to some property, and setters, as the name can probably tell you, are used to set the values pertaining to a property. So something like below. So we can use the keyword get and set to define getters and setters. So what I will do is I will define a field, a class field, and set that to Earth. So planet field, which is a class field, or a person field on the person class, and set that to Earth. And then I will define a getter using the get keyword to get the value pertaining to this property. So I will say return this dot underscore planet. So this is our getter. And to define a setter, I can say set planet, and I can say this dot underscore planet, and we will have to supply a value for the planet. So I can say another planet and set that to this dot underscore planet. Now keep in mind that under the hood, these getters and setters, just like our normal instance methods like log person information, are defined on the class prototype, on the person.prototype, and not on the class, not on the person class. Okay. Now to access a setter, you will have to access the prototype first, and then on the prototype, whatever setter you are having, you can provide that some value. So what I will do is, outside the class, I will access the prototype, so person.prototype, and let us make use of the setter function, and then let us say planet, and provide it a value of say Mars. And now to get the value, to basically access a getter, which is the planet here, which is a planet method, so you can simply reach out to the getter property defined on the prototype of your person class. So I can say console.log person.prototype.planet, and let us see the output in the browser. So you can see we are getting Mars, okay, using the getters and setters. Now let us discuss how we can create a new instance of the class. We can make use of the we can basically create a new instance of the class by using something called as the new keyword. Now let us see how we can create a new instance. So say to create a new instance of the class, so const person object new person. So I'm using the new keyword that we had discussed in the previous video, and I will pass some values to it. So the name of the person is Alex, the age is 21, gender is male, and is he a gamer? So let us set that to false. And then I will invoke the log person information method, which is an instance method that is defined on the person prototype. So I can say person object dot log person information, and let us see the output in the browser. So you can see we are getting Alex is a male and is 21 years old. Gamer status is set to false. Now to invoke a static method that we had created, we can directly use the name of the class followed by a dot and then the name of the static method. So let us see how we can do that. So I will say static methods, so console.log using the person class. So all the static methods are directly accessed using the name of the class. Okay, so you don't need to access the prototype of the person class. You can simply say person dot the static method which is described. And if I go back to the browser to see the output, you can see we are getting I am the person class. Now let us move forward to understand about inheritance in JavaScript. Now inheritance is not like one you have in static languages like C++ and Java. Rather, it's based upon the prototypal concept which we learned in the previous video. Now what I will do is I will define a new class. So I will say class teacher extends. So using the extends keyword, I'm setting up a prototypal link between the teacher class and the person class. So we are basically inheriting the person class. Okay. So using the extend keyword, the derived class, which is the teacher class in this case. So teacher class is your derived class. So using the extend keyword, the teacher class that we are going to create can inherit the properties and methods from the base class, which is person in our case, and its prototype as well. So we can use them in our derived class that we are just going to create. So you must be wondering, what is inheritance? So inheritance is when a derived class will basically inherit or extend the properties. So it is inheriting the properties and methods from its parent class. The class from which the properties and methods are inherited is known as the base class, and the class which inherits these properties and methods is known as the derived class. So it is also called as subclassing. Now you create a specific class from a more generic class. So let us define some properties and methods on our class. So let me define a class field on the teacher class. So I will say profession and set that to teacher. Now profession here is a class field, though when you create an object you can interchangeably call it as a field or a property as well for that matter. So now let us define the constructor method on it. So constructor, I will pass name, age, gender is gamer, school, department, and say subject. Now we can make use of something called as a super keyword, and we can call the parent class constructor method and pass some of the arguments that are provided by the end user to the person constructor that every person has, because in the end we know that every teacher is a person because we have derived the teacher class from the person class. So let us extend the responsibility of setting some of the properties of the teacher class to the person class, to the person constructor to be more specific. So what I will do is I will call the parent constructor, so the constructor of the parent class from which we are deriving the properties and methods, and I will basically, when I'm going to create a new teacher, I'm going to pass the name, age, gender, and is gamer property of the teacher that we are going to create, and assign the responsibility of getting those values for our teacher object to the person class. Okay, so super name, age, gender, and is gamer, and the other properties we can set in our own constructor. So I can say this dot school is set to school, this dot department is set to department, and this dot subject is set to subject. Now let us create a new instance for our teacher class. So I will say const teacher object, and I will say new teacher, and I will pass a name called Elena, set the age to 26, gender to female, is gamer is false, and school can be say Maritime High School, then department is say XYZ, and subject, let the subject be physics. Now let us log the teacher object to the console, and let us check the output in the browser. So you can see we are getting a new teacher object, and we basically inherited the properties that we had defined on the parent class, which in this case is person class. So we are getting the planet property. Okay, the planet class field that we had defined on the person class, we are inheriting that from the person class. Then we have the name property that we set using the person constructor and not the teacher constructor, because we set those we send those values to the person constructor, and the person constructor took the responsibility of setting the value for name, age, gender, and schema. Then we have other properties like profession, school, department, subject that we set using our own constructor, using the teacher constructor. Okay, so this is how inheritance works in general. Now if you now try to access all the properties for the teacher object or the teacher instance that you set up using the person class constructor that is working using the base class constructor, you can see it works. So what I will do is I will say console.log teacher object dot name, and let us check the output in the browser. So we are getting Eleanor. So we are able to access the properties that we set using the person constructor. So we set the name property using the person constructor, but basically we are building up a teacher object from the person object as well, because we passed the name, age, gender, and schema properties to the person class, and we assigned it the responsibility of setting these properties for us. Okay, so these properties were set up by the person class constructor, and all other properties we set on our teacher constructor. Okay, so you can see this works in general using inheritance. So this was all about the video on classes and object-oriented programming, where we learned how we can create classes, create instances based on those classes, and performing inheritance between classes. So let's catch up in the next video.